Hello everyone, this is Horn here. Today we're talking about how to stress out a plant. Even plants can get stressed out. Plants are going to get stressed out when the environment changes, so either something abiotic or something biotic. We're going to start talking about abiotic changes that are going to alter a plant. We're going to stress it out. Luckily, plants have many adaptations that will help them overcome things that are changing the environment. When water is scarce in the environment, this is when there's a drought. A drought is when the roots cannot take up enough water to balance out how much water is being lost through transpiration of the leaves. So when drought occurs, a plant needs to do a couple of things to conserve the water that it already has in it. And the first thing that it has to do is it will lower the transpiration rate. So it's going to lower how much water is lost during transpiration through the leaves. Now with less water available, or less water in the leaves, the guard cells have a decreased turgor pressure and are going to close the stomata. And the picture that I have here shows on the left guard cells that are very plump and full of water. The turgor pressure is very high, which opens up that stomate. The picture that is on the right shows the stomata closed because the turgor pressure is decreased. Those guard cells have shrunk. There's not a lot of water in them to keep that stomata open. The other thing that a plant can do when there is drought is that it wilts and it rolls up the leaves, which are going to help reduce transpiration and photosynthesis. And here's a perfect example of a plant in my house that I have not watered in a while. It's not looking too good, but that's what it's supposed to be doing to try to conserve the water. I gotta remember to water that thing. On the other hand, there could be too much water, and when there's too much water, the roots of the plants cannot get enough oxygen. There's just not any space in the soil for oxygen to diffuse easily into the root. And that oxygen deprivation causes the production of ethylene. Ethylene is a hormone. When ethylene is produced, it leads to something called apoptosis. That's the death, the self-destruction of the cells in the roots. Now, that is actually a helpful thing because when some of those cells die and they're not taking up that space anymore, they're not doing anything, they start to leave some available space so that oxygen can now very easily move in through the soil into the roots and supply them with oxygen that they've been deprived of. Think of that space as a snorkel. So if the roots were to kill off a couple of cells, they've now opened up an airway for oxygen to get in, just like this tube on the snorkel, and oxygen molecules can much easier get into the space. There are some plants, however, that have adaptations to allow them to survive in water all the time. These are mangroves. I've seen them in Florida. I saw them when I went down on my trip to the Everglades. And what you see on the outside here, they look like twigs, those are the roots. The roots are partly above the water, and then most of the roots are actually in the water. This water here is very high in salt content. It's a mixture of salt water and fresh water. We call it brackish water. But anyways, these mangroves have adapted to grow completely covered in water because the roots, part of them are above ground. So oxygen from the atmosphere will go right into this part of the roots so that the bottom part of the roots, they don't kill off cells to make little snorkels. They don't need them because they get the oxygen from up top. I just mentioned salt when I was talking about the mangroves, and salt just happens to be the next abiotic factor that's going to stress out a plant. Salt can alter the water potential of the soil surrounding the plant. So when that happens, the water potential decreases in the soil. So water wants to move from the root and be out into the soil. The salts that's in high concentrations can actually be toxic to the roots of the plant. It could affect the permeability of the cell membrane of all the cells. One thing that the plant starts to do to combat this environmental change is that it starts to produce organic molecules to keep the water potential lower in the plant. So by making more carbohydrates or putting together more proteins, it lowers the water potential in the plant. So water is going to want to move against toward the concentration gradient, and it's going to want to move into the plant. So that's how one way a plant is going to combat exposure to salt. We've talked many times in lab situations how heat or increase in temperature has an effect on the enzymes of a chemical reaction. The same holds true for plants. When plants are exposed to extreme temperatures, to be over 40 degrees Celsius, which we're in the 95 to 100 degree Fahrenheit range, it will destroy the enzymes in the plant, and it's going to mess up the metabolism of the plant. So it's going to affect cellular respiration, it could affect photosynthesis, it could affect synthesis of any enzymes or proteins in the plant. The stomata is going to close in an effort to conserve the water, and then the plant is going to produce some special proteins. We call them heat shock proteins, and these proteins are meant to protect other proteins when the temperature gets too high. So the regular proteins are just regular, they cannot withstand the heat, but when it does get too hot, some plants can produce protective proteins to protect the other molecules in the plant and help them continue with their daily activities and not disrupt metabolism. And if there's extreme heat, there can also be extreme cold. Really cold temperatures affect the fluidity in the membranes of cells, and if that happens, molecules can actually become locked into place. To combat this, a plant will increase the production of lipids, and having more lipids in the cell membrane will continue the fluidity and help the cell membranes continue to move and have materials still able to move in and out of a cell. So we've talked about 5 different ways how abiotic factors in the environment can stress out a plant. Now I want to show you some ways that other living things can stress out a plant too. The first one is herbivores. Herbivores are plant eaters. They want to eat plants, and sometimes by doing that, the plant gets really worried. I'd be worried too if somebody was munching on a leaf or a flower that I needed to survive, that I needed to carry on the next, continue the species. Plants have physical barriers, like thorns. Thorns sometimes are enough to, for herbivores to not eat or nibble on a leaf or a stem. Sometimes a thorn is enough. Sometimes it's not. If a physical barrier wasn't enough to deter something from eating a leaf or a stem, it may so happen that let's take a caterpillar, could start eating a leaf. As it eats the leaf, it's wounding the plant. It's also releasing saliva, and that caterpillar has chemicals in a saliva that are going to start to trigger a response in the plant. As we talked earlier in chapter 39, the signal transduction pathway is going to begin. Because of this chemical in the saliva, it's going to trigger a process that's going to help the plant make something. The plant is now going to start synthesizing a chemical. It's going to release that chemical, and that chemical is meant to go out into the environment and start recruiting. Now, it's not going to recruit just anything. It's recruiting a particular type of a wasp. It's recruiting a parasitoid wasp. Once this wasp detects this chemical signal in the environment, the wasp is now attracted to this area. As the wasp comes over and realizes there's a caterpillar in the area, its first thought is not, I need to save the plant. Its first thought is, oh, there's a great spot to lay my eggs. And this parasitoid wasp will now lay its eggs inside the caterpillar. The caterpillar is still alive, as this happens, of course. The eggs will, within a short period of time, begin to hatch, and the larva will start to eat the caterpillar from the inside out. So that's why we call it a parasitoid wasp, because it doesn't simply attack it, but it will use it as a host, as a nice warm, cozy place for its eggs to hang out. The larva will hatch out of the eggs, and then the larva will have an instant and immediate source of food available right around it. Because this is happening, though, the caterpillar dies and stops eating the plant, so very tricky of the plant to use the wasp as some backup. Just like humans have an immune system and we fight off pathogens, plants do the same thing. Now, a pathogen is a harmful microorganism. So let's think viruses, bacteria. If a pathogen were to try to get into a plant, the plant has a very obvious first line of defense. Pathogens just simply can't get in. They can't get into the leaf unless there's a hole, unless there's a tear. And the only way there's going to be a hole or a tear is if an herbivore got there first. Then the pathogen can get in. So if we think about that caterpillar and how it had been snacking on that leaf, then the caterpillar died. But now that plant has an open wound, and pathogens have a free pass in. If pathogens get in, then the second line of defense is going to have to kick into gear. There's two things that could happen in the second line of defense. And the first is called a hypersensitive response. And I mentioned the word apoptosis before. If cells are getting infected by a virus or a bacteria, all of the cells that are in the surrounding area of those that are being infected are going to destroy themselves. And they destroy themselves to avoid allowing that virus to spread. A virus is only going to spread if it will spread through living cells. So, if we can kill some cells, the virus will have almost a barrier. It won't be able to hop to the next living cell because there isn't anything nearby. This type of a defense is very localized. It's very specific. The last line of defense that a plant might do is called systemic acquired resistance. This is more non-specific. This resistance is going to kick into gear if something enters the plant and doesn't really know what it is, but it knows that something foreign is there, so it has to do something. It provides protection against all pathogens for a few days. So messages would be sent from the tips of the root to the tips of the leaves that something is foreign in the body, and it's gonna produce a heightened immunity or an immune system to all pathogens and viruses. The downside is it only lasts for a few days. So if the pathogen were able to stick around a little bit longer than that, it's not going to hold up. Well, that finishes off chapter 39, and I hope this helps.